morning. If you have the program, you will have inferred immediately that I'm not Andrea Bayer, who is the wonderful curator who organized the Renaissance exhibition that's upstairs. I'm Kent Leidecker, recently retired Associate Director for Education here at the Metropolitan. It gives me very great pleasure to stand in for Andrea, who's in Europe researching another exhibition project having to do with portraiture, but to sub for her and introduce this wonderful two-day symposium that the Metropolitan, Columbia, and the Free University in Berlin have organized together with most of the real work being done at Columbia in the philosophy department, as will become clear. This wonderful conference, Instruments of Passion, Music, Painting, and the Contest of the Arts. It's very appropriate that this conference occur for one of its days here at the Metropolitan Museum, because the Metropolitan, a little exceptional among American museums, has an entire department, curatorial department, dedicated to musical instruments. And it is one of the extraordinary, perhaps accidents, or perhaps it was fate, that the Crosby Brown collection, which is one of the most extraordinary collections of instruments on the planet, came to rest here in the Metropolitan. It has been the subject of study and investigation, both by its own curators, but also a stimulus for scholarship across the entire field of music, the visual arts, and cultural expression in every form. So for that reason, I applaud the conference, applaud the organization of it, and the fact that it's taking place here in the Metropolitan. And that having been said, and I know you've all read the slide that flashed on that said, turn off your cell phone so we don't have musical accompaniment during our conference papers. But without further ado, let me introduce one of the organizers of the conference, Professor Lydia Gurr of the Philosophy Department at Columbia University. Lydia.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. On behalf of Klaus Kruger and myself, we would like to welcome you all to this international symposium, Instruments of Passion, Music, Painting, and the Contest of the Arts. There are many persons, and I wanted to say institutional bodies, but I thought instrumental bodies was actually more appropriate, whom we would like to thank for their generous support. First off, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Andrea Bayer, and especially Joseph Lowe for his enthusiastic encouragement and organizational talents. The Languages of Emotion Excellence Cluster of the Freie Universität Berlin, Columbia University Arts Initiative, Departments of Art, History and Archaeology, Music and Philosophy, the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America, and David Friedberg, who unfortunately can't be with us today, and Columbia University's Music Performance Program, and to Columbia University's School of the Arts. In addition, we would like to thank my several marvelous graduate students, most of all Michael Seifried, for his indispensable help in seeing to all those little details, including food and wine, without which a symposium can't happen. We would also like to thank Sean Michael Parr, Mark Cito, and Patrick Kaleo for all their efforts in putting the production together of the Bach Cantata 201 on the contest between Phoebus and Pan, with singers and instrumentalists associated with Columbia University. This you'll have the rare opportunity to hear tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, beginning with introductory remarks by Professor Elaine Sisman. I'd also like in this regard to thank Susan Weiss for the loan of some marvelous instruments, which you will see on the stage. Since places are more limited at the Italian Academy at Columbia than here, we'd recommend you arriving for the concert by 6:40. Those of you who want to attend the symposium talks tomorrow are encouraged to arrive at Columbia University's Italian Academy, Casa Italiana, by 8:50 or a few minutes prior to the start time of each talk. All details are in the brochure. If any of you have never stepped on the west side of Manhattan and don't know where Columbia University is, you basically want to go to Amsterdam and about 1/16 and ask for the precise address in the brochure, and there you will see a pseudo-mock Renaissance building, I think sponsored once by Mussolini, and a present of the Italian government to Columbia, and in there you will find us addressing various themes. Tomorrow afternoon also, because of the pressure of the performance, Klaus Kruger's lecture will begin at 4:15 instead of 4:30. That's if we're running on time. Now, although divided geographically between the east and west sides of Manhattan, this symposium is a unified event. It will begin at the end of at least one of the contests of the 20th century with a talk by Arthur Danto, who will appear in a moment, and will be introduced by Jonathan Gilmore of Yale University. After Danto's talk, the conference and contest will move backward through time until we arrive in the agonistic age of the Renaissance, the so-called rebirth of the arts and everything else, where tomorrow we will mostly stay, other than a few excursions into later centuries, when film theorist Gertrude Koch from Berlin will find anxieties in Athena in the recent video performances of Madonna, and when John Hamilton will explore the musicality in the novellas of Balzac. All further details of the talks and times and locations, as I've already said, can be found in the symposium brochure. The aim of this symposium is in part strategic, to encourage discussion between the different disciplines and departments in our so-called age of intermediality, but much more, it is the intellectual outcome of conversations between Klaus Kruger and myself, in which we've explored paintings and sculptures in which music, and particularly the contest between Apollo and Marsyas, have performed so central a role. How exactly music enters into the visual and plastic arts, or visual art into the musical arts of singing, playing, and poeticizing, is the question many of our symposiasts will address. But in addition, we will look at how agonizing the argon or contest of the arts has historically been, especially to pick up on a theme from the work of Arthur Danto, when the contest has been controlled by the not very hidden strings of philosophy. With that, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Gilmore, a professor of philosophy at Yale University. Thank you very much.
It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Arthur Danto, Johnsonian Professor of Philosophy Emeritus of Columbia University, where he's taught since 1951, and Art Critic of the Nation, a post he's held since 1984. Professor Danto is the author of 27 books, many now translated into several languages, and countless contributions to exhibition catalogs, magazines, and academic journals. And he's the subject himself of several edited volumes of essays by others. He's written influential texts on the philosophy of history, philosophy of action, theory of knowledge, the nature of mind and mental representation, on perception, Nietzsche, Sartre, African art, Buddhism, beauty, erotic love, the definition of art, the end of art, the nature of photography and film, and the censorship, ethics, and politics of art. He's the recipient of too many awards to mention, but they include 2 Guggenheims, a Fulbright, election to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, an Icelandic literary prize, the name of which I cannot pronounce, and the Grand Prix de Philosophie awarded by the Académie Française. As Danto's readers know, his art criticism is often leavened with philosophical reflection, and his philosophy is often deepened by appeal to the arts. And it's just this marriage in his writing of the general style of thought characteristic of philosophy with the deep sensitivity to the particular histories, media, methods, and meanings of works of art. It's just this marriage of the two that's made Danto the most influential philosopher of art of the past several decades. We see that joining of art historical flesh to philosophical spirit as early as 1964, when he wrote an essay called The Art World that quaintly referred to a certain Mr. Andy Warhol, a figure whom few in his audience of philosophers would have recognized, or had they recognized, would have thought worth taking seriously. With that essay and the writing that followed, Danto initiated a revolution in philosophical theorizing about the arts, about its essence. A revolution in which Danto once again began to ask the truly grand questions about art, about its essence and its history, questions that were forsworn by an earlier generation of philosophers allergic to metaphysical speculation and anyway quite weary of attributing any great significance to what art or literature had to say. And apropos of a conference on the Paragone, I'll close by mentioning that Danto once offered the thesis that ever since Plato spoke of the so-called ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, philosophy has defined itself through an invidious comparison with the arts, diminishing them in one way or another. What this means, Danto concluded, is that a philosophical reconception of art could not leave philosophy's own self-conception unchanged. And I think we can see that now in Danto's demonstration that some of the deepest philosophical discoveries, both about what gives art meaning and what gives life meaning, these discoveries can emerge not from armchair abstract theorizing or even from reading other philosophers, but from a passionate engagement with art itself. I trust that we'll see that engagement today. Join me in welcoming Arthur Danto.
Thank you, Jonathan. This talk grew out of a critique I presented publicly earlier this year of Peter Gay's book, Modernism, and Lydia heard it and thought it could easily be adapted to her conference, and that's how one writes a lot of things, and in my case, I feel I keep writing the same thing. It keeps stretching out into different branches. The last great paragone in the history of art was between painting and photography, which differed from the typical paragone in which the terms of the comparison were forms of art, in that there was some lingering resistance to classing photography as an art. That seemed to have been settled rather quickly in France, where photographs were shown for the first time in the 1857 Salon, along with painting and sculpture. The daguerreotype, the French version of the photograph, was invented in 1839, so it's pretty fast. Whereas, on this side of the ocean, Alfred Stieglitz, the great photographer, still felt rejected as an artist in 1917. I'm having difficulty finding out whether photographs were shown in the 1917 exhibition of independent artists here in New York at Grand Central Palace, an exhibition which was notorious mainly for having rejected Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, which, as we all know, was a urinal rotated onto its back and crudely signed Armat and dated 1917. That exhibition, the independent artists, was modeled on the French Society of Independent Artists, which was committed to the principle of no jury and no prizes. To forestall, that's to say, the Salon des Refusés of 1863 with its fiercely exigent jury. When, after the opening of the independent artists, Beatrice Wood, Duchamp himself, and some others carried Fountain to Stieglitz's gallery, had a gallery at 291 Fifth Avenue. They went down at Duchamp's urging to ask Stieglitz to photograph it, which is why we happen to know exactly what that legendary object looks like. And Stieglitz obliged, feeling that there was a kinship with Duchamp he had, since photographers were routinely rejected as artists. So whether photography was one of the fine arts was still moot in America when the First World War broke out, and Stieglitz closed his gallery in 1917. I think it was considered moot by philosophers when it had been settled by art museums. A collection of Stieglitz's photographs was acquired by the Albright Knox Museum in 1930, and the Museum of Modern Art proclaimed its modernity by establishing a department of photography in 1940, curated by Edward Steichen. But as late as 1958, the philosopher William Koenig could still suggest to a philosophical readership that photographs are a borderline case of artworks. That's doubtless because the range of photographs go from a yellowing snapshot of Aunt Sadie and Uncle Al on their honeymoon at Cedar Point to Andreas Gursky's 99-cent diptych, which sold for $3,346,456 at Sotheby's a little over a year ago. So perhaps the complication did not arise immediately in France, since the photograph in question would have been an early daguerreotype, probably pricier than the average miniature hand-painted by some artisan, albeit on ivory. Stieglitz painted a handsome compliment to Duchamp. I suppose I can go back and show that, by photographing it in front of what most people would have considered a pretty serious painting, Marston Hartley's painting called The Warriors. The Paragone was instantly conceded when the painter Paul Delaroche, on first learning of Louis Daguerre's invention, is said to have said, as of today, painting is dead. That's in 1839. No one, so far as I've been able to determine, has established that Delaroche actually said that, and nobody seems to know exactly what he might have meant for it exactly. For example, Delaroche was a great history painter when history painting was still considered the most prestigious genre of painting by the various academies of art. But as Delaroche practiced historical painting, it was scarcely something that could have been threatened by photography, inasmuch as most of the events he depicted took place in the past, and he was more interested in telling a good story than in depicting the past vis eigentlich gewesen, to use von Ranke's famous definition of history. Thus, de la Roche depicted the execution of Lady Jane Grey, Henry VIII's wife, or one of his wives, as taking place in a dungeon, contrary to the historical record. That, I don't know if I've, no. Contrary to the historical record, that possibility for painting was to become central in the ensuing paragone between painting and photography from 1839 until about 1930, when the paragone ended and photography was grudgingly granted the status of art. What de la Roche would almost certainly have had in mind was that it's simply irrational for human beings to have to learn to use instruments like pencils and brushes to create pictures of the world when a portrait or a landscape surpassing what most artists could achieve in realistic conviction could be produced by clicking a shutter, requiring no skill at all. Obviously, there's more to the matter than just clicking something. A daguerreotype is a mirrored metal plate coated with silver halide particles deposited by means of iodine vapor. An image is projected, which sets up a chemical process, and the image is fixed after an exposure of some seconds. All that's true, but there is something uncanny in the way a complete likeness could form on a metal plate with a daguerreotype. Few artists could draw something so vividly lifelike as an early portrait of Lincoln. This is a daguerreotype. That's from the 1840s, and I found it, I swiped it from Wikipedia, but I thought it would be a nice tribute to Barack Obama. But it's a very beautiful, almost drawing-like image. Few artists could draw something so vividly lifelike as that particular portrait of Lincoln. Its magic, the daguerreotype, in the further sense that it captures details invisible to the naked eye, unlike photographs that use paper negatives, also invented in 1839, in the process invented by Fox Talbot, the British inventor. In that sense, the superiority of the camera over the hand and eye method of representing connects with a tradition that more or less had vanished with the Renaissance. The tradition is brilliantly tracked by the art historian Hans Belting in his masterpiece, Kult and Bild, Cult and Image, where the kinds of pictures people were interested in from, Hans believes, from the decline of the Roman Empire until the Renaissance, were images that were not made by an artist's hand at all, but by some mystical intervention, as in the case of Veronica's veil, where Christ's perspiring face appeared by magical transfer, as was believed to be the case, for example, also with the Shroud of Turin. And of course, the portrait of the Virgin that St. Luke set out to paint with skills that the Virgin knew St. Luke was not up to, so that what she did was through some miracle. No, that's not what I want. Well, I can keep going. Yeah, there. Sorry. Here's St. Luke demonstrating what the Virgin did in this wonderful painting by Guercino. He's showing not something that he's painted, but something that the Virgin brought about as a miracle, so lifelike that the angel here, looking over St. Luke's shoulder, feels that it is tangible, that you can touch it, or wants to see whether it's real or illusory. The image on the canvas of the panel is internally related to the Virgin the way a mirror image would be. The Virgin is present in the image, so you're directly praying to her in praying to the picture, and there's accordingly the possibility that whatever it is that you wish for could be granted. Possibly the portrait itself is an answered prayer by St. Luke. St. Luke says, I want to paint the Virgin, but I don't know how to do that. And the Virgin says, don't worry, St. Luke. And then, lo and behold, her image appears on that panel. Since everybody knew, St. Luke himself knew that his actual painting skills were not up to much. In any case, to say that you would have thought it was done by a camera is in effect to say it looks as though nature painted itself. Now I'm going to have to go back. As if the artist had nothing to do with it. And it takes, as you would know, a great deal of skill to make your art look like it was an example of photography. De la Roche generously helped get a government pension for Daguerre, whose real achievement, in his own mind, was his other invention, the diorama. Daguerre was interested in photography only because he thought it would make his dioramas more realistic than they would have been had he painted the diorama as, for example, the dioramas you see here in the Museum of Natural History. And in his recommendation to the government, de la Roche wrote, Daguerre's process completely satisfies all the demands of art, carrying essential principles of art to such perfection that it must become a subject of observation and study even to the most accomplished painters. With that concession by Paul de la Roche, we can begin to construct the Paragone, which consisted in photography's boast that it, more than painting, was able to show how things really look when produced in a way that can't be bettered. A good early example of what I have in mind are these rather obscure American pre-Raphaelite paintings. These painters, this is a painting by William Mason Brown, and it's called Raspberries. And this is a painting of birds' eggs by, again, a very obscure painter named John William Hill. I got interested in these paintings by the American pre-Raphaelite painters because Russell Sturgis, who was the first art critic for the Nation magazine, which I've written art criticism for myself for the last number of years. Russell Sturgis was not merely the nation's first art critic, but was one of the founders of professional art criticism in the United States. He believed that the future of American painting lay with artists like this, rather than with the kind of art that was being turned out by members of the American Academy of Design. Like the British Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, who had secured the endorsement of John Ruskin, England's leading art critic, they believed in what they called visual truth. Ruskin wrote in the London Times of 1851 that since Raphael, artists had sought, quote, to paint fair pictures rather than stern facts, but that these artists were resolved to paint only what they see, irrespective, Ruskin continues, of any conventional rules of picture making. And what interests me particularly was that the highest compliment that the American pre-Raffs, as they called themselves, could pay one another. They'd say, you would have thought, looking at that it had been made by a camera. Which raised the question, I suppose, of why not just use the camera? Why get to the point where you could learn to paint a bird's eggs or flowers on a forest floor or a nest like that, so convincing that you could say you would have thought a camera might have done it. Say, well, why not just use a camera if that's what art finally, painting finally comes to, instead of painstakingly what the camera achieves without that kind of effort. The camera presumably showed only what the eye sees and nothing more. Hence, it had to set the criterion of visual truth. Its relevance to art was to show what visual truth was in any given instance. That's why that's your first step in the paragone. They say, well, if you want visual truth, then use a camera. And then the second best thing is to paint it the way a camera would show it if you'd used a camera to do it. It did only strike me as a philosopher rather recently that 19th century painters must have believed that visual truth was defined by photography, however alien to human vision what the camera reproduced often was. A good example of this would have been Edward Muybridge's photographs of horses in motion. Painters had decided that Muybridge's images show what horses really look like when they run, and in effect, the painters, once Muybridge's photographs were available, copied Muybridge's photographs of horses, even though that's not really at all the way horses actually look, or the way we see horses when they run. We don't see animals move the way Muybridge shows them moving. Well, there wouldn't have been any need for the camera in the first place if that were true. It's because we don't know how horses move their legs or dispose of their legs that Muybridge had to invent this somewhat crude device of a bank of cameras would show a horse move successfully through a series of points. It's because the human eye can't tell whether all four of a horse's legs ever touch the ground at the same time. It's because of that that Muybridge hit upon this awkward but seemingly authoritative experiment that were really designed to answer such questions. Muybridge's published images had an impact on artists like Eakins and the Futurists, and here a sculpture by Degas, who often also in his paintings shows a horse moving stiff-leggedly across the turf, exactly the way it can be seen in Muybridge's photographs of it, but never really in life. Degas, who took up photography himself, would have argued that the photographs teach us how we must see, even if the images look quite unnatural. That, I say, confuses optical truth with visual truth. Muybridge used to mock, when he'd give lectures on his invention, the Victorian horse painters whose depictions of horses racing was visually always far more convincing than Muybridge's optically correct photographs could have been. They show horses stereotypically, where that's not the way Muybridge shows them at all. And another example is portraits. Most of what the human face shows is not so much the kind of physiognomic expressions, grief, joy, anger, that academic artists had to master in order to show in narrative paintings how persons felt, but transitions between expressions. So that with ASA 160 and shutter speed, say, of a 60th of a second, you can capture the face appearing in ways which the eye never sees, the way the face appears between expressions, one might say. That's why we reject, as not really me, many of the images on a contact sheet which don't look like what we see in the mirror. The result is that faces are defamiliarized by the camera, as in the typical portrait by Richard Avedon. What it really amounts to with the modern camera is that the photographer is stopping movement, hence making stills, with results that never arose or could never have arisen with painted portraits. And that's really what Degas is a three-dimensional still. The still shows optical truth, but it doesn't correspond to perceptual truth, namely how we see the world stereotypically. And I realized that when I saw this. I really got angry with this one. This is Avedon's portrait of the philosopher. The title of it is The Philosopher Isaiah Berlin. I knew Isaiah Berlin pretty well. He was actually a friend, and I thought, this is not the way the philosopher Isaiah Berlin looked. Certainly not to anybody who knew him. What it shows is an unrecognizable and invisible sourpuss. It is, moreover, false to say that sometimes he looks like that. He never looked like that. He was always talking. He was always on the edge of his chair making a point. He only does that for a camera set at ASA 160 f22 which, of course, one doesn't see. The camera shows, on this view, the eye's limitations. It shows how things would really look if we could but see them the way the lens does. So you can take a shot from a contact sheet in the confidence that it really shows the real as it is, better by far than the false image of a smiling subject asked, hold it, that's it, hold it, and so forth that you see in fashion shots. So those thoughts came home to me rather vividly, and this is what I'm aiming at. When I was moved to think about Manet's painting of the execution of Maximilian, done in 4 versions from 1865 to 1867, which were shown together in John Elderfield's marvelous didactic exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in May 2006. There were no photographs of the event of Maximilian's execution, since that was forbidden by the Mexican authorities. Manet depended on details that came out in the newspaper that kept changing as the reports came in. So at first, Manet supposed that the execution was carried out by Mexican guerrillas, and then he painted the members of the firing squad wearing sombreros. Gradually, it did become known that the firing squad was made up of Mexican soldiers in uniform, though far more tattered, as we know from a contemporary photograph, than Manet's final and official version shows. It all at once occurred to me that Manet was seeking to show the event the way it would look if it had been photographed. He painted it at just the moment when the guns had been fired, there's smoke coming out of their muzzles, and one of the victims is falling down, fatally wounded. Photography was not yet capable of recording things that fast. The Leica wouldn't be invented until the next century. Film was really too slow. Exposure times were long, but certain things peculiar to the photograph appears in this painting, the way it's organized. There's a remarkable sketch of the history of what Clement Greenberg designates as modernism, written in 1957, which is just the whole thing in a nutshell. Greenberg wrote in The Nation, by the way, from Giotto to Courbet, the painter's first task had been to hollow out an illusion of three-dimensional space. This illusion was conceived of more or less as a stage animated by visual incident, and the surface of the picture as the window through which one looked at the stage. But Manet began to pull the backdrop of the stage forward, and those who came after him kept pulling it forward, until today it has come smack up against the window, blocking it up and hiding the stage. All the painter has left to work with now is, so to speak, a more or less opaque window pane. No one else I know of has described the shift from traditional to modernist representation in those terms, nor would anyone else have credited Manet with having begun the modernist program in quite that way. But I find it a very clarifying approach, however much I might otherwise differ from Greenberg, as a critic certainly. The question for me is, what explains that momentous reconception of pictorial space on Manet's part? And what I wanted to offer is a conjecture that it was the effect of photography, which most will grant is really the truly revolutionary invention in the history of representational technology in modern times. Greenberg is famous for saying that the defining essence of the medium of painting is flatness, which means, in effect, the denial of illusory space that was a necessary condition for the great creative achievement of painting from, in his words, Giotto to Courbet. It was the observation, whatever its problems, that encouraged Greenberg to propose that modernism began with Manet. What's needed to put these two thoughts together into a causal narrative is the recognition that photography played an operative role in the transformation of art from traditional to modern. What, after all, could have been more modern than the photographic camera with its ability to fix images, which until then were ephemeral and fleeting, as in the camera oscura. The camera shortened depth brought, in Greenberg's words, the background forward and flattened forms, largely, I think, because the lenses of the period were often telescopic lenses, which showed things closer together than they would look to the eye, almost on top of one another, in the way in which the firing squad looks physically, as if it's physically placed the muzzles of the guns much closer to the victims' faces than they are. You see that today, it's a commonplace looking at a television set. When you look at a baseball game, the pitcher is on top of the batter. That's because you have to photograph it telescopically, and the telescopic lens does that. Putting the pitcher and the batter in that way, almost as though they're superimposed. Manet was inspired by the 3rd of May, El Triste de Mayo, which also shows an execution. But in fact, Maximilian's execution gave Manet an opportunity to paint an execution, which his trip to Madrid inspired him with. But the camera didn't exist in 1812 when this painting was done by Goya. The distances are not distorted in the name of visual truth. Manet also tended to suppress transitional tones, which emulates the way frontally illuminated objects in a photograph drives the shadows to the edges, inevitably flattening forms. This is an effect which Manet seized upon in painting his portraits. And Greenberg writes that for the sake of luminousness, Manet was willing to accept this flatness. He got all these points, which is pretty remarkable. A further truth is that the lenses tended to give a forward central thrust to the image, as in Manet's wonderful Gare Saint-Lazare, where everything is crowded into the foreground. And I would really wager that Manet's painting owes a lot to discussions which he had with a photographer, Nader, in whose studio the first Impressionist exhibition took place in 1874. So an argument can be made that the camera is what made modernism, as defined by Greenberg, happen. There's a wonderful caricature. Here's Nadar himself in a balloon over Paris, done by Daumier. Nadar was the first one to do aerial photography using balloons, and he had a clear sense of what happens in telephotography. Daumier titles his picture, Nadar élevant la photographie à le niveau de l'art. In my conjecture, amounts to substituting Manet's name for Nadar and reversing the terms. The irony of Greenberg's theory of flatness, set forth in his 1960 essay, Modernist Painting, is that it was supposed to rest on the reduction of the medium of painting to its essence, which turns out to have been an artifact of another medium altogether, namely photography. So much for the purity of media that was meant to be the foundation of his theory of criticism. And my conjecture is that Manet imitated the camera here by introducing, as if visual reality were what artifacts of the photographic, this is what visual reality was, as shown by the photographic processes at the time, but it was actually an artifact, as people in computers say, an artifact of the photographic process, that things look flat. By a coincidence of scheduling, the Museum of Modern Art mounted two shows at the same time. One of Manet's execution, where we can look for signs of the beginning of modernism, and I wrote this up in The Nation in these terms, and the other on the upper floor, the sixth floor, were paintings by Bryce Marden. That is actually a painting, although it looks like I've lost a slide. This is one of the paintings, monochrome paintings, which the gray and gray monochromes, which in the context made me feel as though I was looking, these are done in the 60s, at the end of modernism as a period style, something that takes you from the execution of Manet until the Bryce Marden. There are some shadowy markings of darker gray, and actually there are other colors in there that serve other contemporary painters like, well, a little earlier, in the backgrounds of portraits by Giacometti or Jasper Johns in some of paintings that he did in the 50s, rows of numerals and so forth and so on. These have that as a kind of a background where against which you place what has the primary interest of the painting, the numerals, if you're Johns, or a portrait of his brother Diego by Giacometti. What Marsden seems to have done is to bring the background forward to coincide with the surface of the paintings, making the surfaces the subjects, turning the paintings into objects. The history of modernism is, on that view, the history of the narrowing of the space between background and foreground, just as Greenberg says, a progress in which important stages are Cézanne's tipping the surface of his tables up toward the viewer, like that, up toward the viewer, creating the kind of space that the Cubists exploited, especially in their collages, the bottle of Suze, with, along the way, the American trompe-l'oeil paintings in which flat objects like newspaper clippings and paper money are pinned or pasted on flat surfaces, enabling painters to eliminate shadows and thus to short-circuit depth. And then there's the inevitable flattening with Gauguin and the Nabi, who prioritized that decoration and adopted the highly decorative format of Art Nouveau, as in the case of Van Gogh, whose work borrowed, in addition, the flatness of forms of the Japanese woodcut print. So that the pre-Raffs, in attempting to emulate the camera, had also to eliminate depth. As you can see, everything There's no depth in the pre-Raphaelite painting, at least the American pre-Raphaelite painting, almost in the way in which happens when you look at something through a microscope. So you can trace the Greenbergian narrative of modernism from Monet to Martinism as the triumph of flatness over illusionist space, culminating in the triumph of two-dimensionality triumphing over three-dimensionality. But that paragone followed a more the actual paragone historically followed a more zigzag path. It wasn't the history of modernism quite at all. The painter might concede the camera's superiority in capturing visual truth, but Delaroche could have argued that painting's superiority lies not in its being tethered to dull old truth. Painting could create its own truth. Nature's pencil, which was the way in which Fox Talbot titled the process, or the book in which he describes the book, simply traces what's set before the lens without creative imagination. The photographer can only represent what's there, whereas the painter is free to use his imagination. This comes up pretty early in the Paragone and shows things other than the way they are or they were. Thus, the liberties that Delaroche took with historical truth. The painter, I don't have that. I don't have it. I'm sorry. I thought I have it, but I don't. But that's a nice example. In the Death and Disaster series, but for a different reason. I'll come to it. So I'll take it away. The painting that I want to describe is one in which Delaroche takes a great deal of liberty with historical truth. It's easy to get that. I'm sorry I gummed it up. The painter selects a moment in which to represent an event which is almost melodramatic. In the case of, for example, the execution of Lady Jane Grey. She's blindfolded, and she's beginning to search in a kind of panic for the executioner's block. She wants a swift, clean death, and she pleads with the axe man to give her that. And so Delaroche paints the straw that's going to soak up Lady Jane's blood and receive her head. But for effect, he sets the scene in a dungeon rather than on a scaffold, which history tells us is the way Lady Jane met her death. In another painting, he shows round-head soldiers blowing pipe smoke in the face of King Charles. He treats painting fictionally. Photographers were not slow to show that they were quite capable of that themselves. This is a famous Victorian photograph by the photographer Henry Peach Robinson. He hired actors and constructed an emotional scene and photographed it as in this photograph called Fading Away, a dying moment of a young woman. It never happened, obviously, but it was a very moving photograph to the Victorian sensibility, and was proof that photographers were not, as a matter of fact, prized, photographs were not prized so much for visual truth, but by showing the visual truth of actual human beings exhibiting certain feelings, they can present imaginary episodes that could have happened, but never did. Peach Robinson was could claim a victory in the way the evolution of the Paragone went along. Here, I don't know how well you can make this out. This is a Jeff Wall photograph. Jeff Wall's much influenced by the Victorian photographers. This happens. I don't know how much illusion you can get from the slide, but Jeff Wall. This is a diorama. I put in this diorama that I saw at the. You would have been able to see it at the Jeff Wall exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. It's a famous diorama. Unfortunately, not one of Daguerre's dioramas, but a little too late, quite a bit too late, 1888, and it's a restoration process, and Jeff Wall, in his characteristic way, has got the people working on the reconstruction, well, not reconstruction, but freshening up the diorama in a somewhat more dramatic way than it would have been. But one could have, if I hadn't wanted to pay my little tribute to Daguerre, I could have given you something a bit more dramatic than that. But you these kinds of scenes, I just saw some photographs by Eleanor Anton, which emulate the painter Alma Tadema, fairly disgusting saccharine Victorian painter of Romans sporting with one another and so forth. But she thought, why would I paint it? Why can't I just pose people, photography, and then photograph them? It's much more contemporary to use a posed photograph than it is to paint. Nobody paints anymore the way they did in Victorian times. So the question, is it art, has very little purchase on a photographer, an artist. Like you say, what is he, an artist? Not a photographer exactly, but not a painter, surely. Is it art, has very little purchase by the time the history of the Paragone reaches an artist like Jeff Wall. The history, the Paragone, you get the artists like the Impressionists, and you say, oh, you could never do that with a photograph. And then you say, well, you can by using soft focus, coated lenses, heavy paper. That was what pictorialism did, emulate painting and so forth and so on. But then why bother if they're still not going to consider what you're doing art? It's art if it's paint done by an impressionist. It's not art if done by a photographer who subscribes to the pictorialism of Stieglitz and Steichen. So that De La Roche's having granted it that status in his letter of support for Daguerre's pension shows, as a matter of fact, a deeper insight into is it art than one might have thought. That became irrelevant when modernism made it irrelevant, when it stopped being important to win contests with cameras. Wall exhibits the postmodernist, post-Greenbergian thesis that whatever works is okay. And Wall's inspiration to use backlighting came when he saw the way bus stop posters do it. I don't have time, I guess, to go much further with this, but if I had time, I would like to show how the not that. Forget it. What I wanted to show was the next move beyond the paragone. The paragone gives way to something very different through the photographic silk screen, where you begin to get the interesting question finally in its philosophical form with Warhol. But unfortunately, I don't have, I seem never to have the time to bring in Warhol to one of these lectures unless I begin with it. So I'll just end here. Thanks very much.